Okay, will do. Okay, okay, bye-bye.
Hello. Hi.
Hello, how are you?
Good
Fine. How about yourself?
Doing well, thank you.
Hope you guys are drinking a lot of water.
Not enough.
Certainly will be.
Ha.
So it is 1 o'clock. We are going to go ahead and get started. I will be muting everyone, and I will also be monitoring the chat. So if there's a question that you have, please feel free to send it to me directly. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eartha Johnson, and I'm the Director of Guided Pathways, Equity, and Achievement at Barstow Community College. So we welcome you to the third installment of the Social Justice Film and Discussion Series. And if you've joined us before, we appreciate your return. Those of you who participated in the discussion on the documentary 13th were asked to share recommended readings on the chat. And unfortunately, I accidentally deleted said chat and would like to offer another opportunity for today's participants to share recommended readings in the chat. So I will certainly endeavor to compile a list and send it out to you. Today we'll be live streaming our discussion on the Barstow YouTube channel. So if for whatever reason you are having some technical difficulties in Zoom, you can always go into the chat, and I'll be posting the link in the chat as well pretty frequently. So given that it's about 1:01, I do want to honor everyone's time and want to make sure that we get started right away. So allow me to introduce our speaker today, Phyllis Morris Green, who is a former San Bernardino County public defender. I would like Ms. Green to maybe share a little bit about her background as a public defender. And I would probably think, Ms. Green, that this movie must have had some particular significance for you on so many levels. So I'm just wondering if you could share with us your initial thoughts and feelings about this movie.
Okay, thank you. So I retired from the public defender's office in 2018. And prior to my retirement, I had served 34 years. Most of that was as a trial attorney. I did trials in San Bernardino, the Big Bear area, and the High Desert area and Redlands. The movie, personally for me, affirms the conviction that individuals have that enter into the area of public defending, because you certainly have to have a commitment to represent. I came up during a time when laws were becoming harsher, and so it seems like every avenue of defense was being taken from you, but you had to continue forward, and you had to do your research and become more creative in your approach. What I liked about Brian was his commitment and the fact that he saw, or he sees, his role as an attorney as his calling. And he really got to know his clients very well. One of the advantages that defense attorneys have is, of the individuals in the courtroom, you're the one who knows your client the best. Behind every crime is a story. And so before we take a case into a courtroom, we want to understand the client's story, because we have a better opportunity of success when we can somehow communicate that story to the jurors. The film Just Mercy talks about the death penalty, which is a hot issue right now, and the status of inmates who are on death row, and to a certain extent, the cruelty that exists because you have individuals waiting to die without knowing when they're going to die. It also brings up another issue that is a hot topic, and that's veterans and mental illness. A lot of vets come back and they have suffered from traumatic brain injuries. And traumatic brain injuries affect how you perceive your world. Things that used to be simple are now difficult. And the way that we thank veterans for their service is to charge them with a crime and incarcerate them when they need assistance, they need help, they need treatment. And then Brian's film, Just Mercy, talks about the emotions of the whole process of being involved in the criminal justice process and how history affects how clients, especially clients of color, are treated in the courtroom. And Miss Earth, I am so sorry, I cannot hear you.
You wouldn't be able to because I was on mute. I'm so busy monitoring so many areas here. I apologize. So thank you for sharing that introduction. I want to kind of kick off our conversation really with something that Brian Stevenson has stated. And that is that there are 4 primary institutions that have shaped the conversation around race and justice today. Slavery, racial terror, and the threat of violence against people of color, Jim Crow laws that legalize segregation, and mass incarceration. What are your thoughts about this?
Yes. Basically, I agree with him. I take a slightly different approach, but history is reflected in the policies that we enforce in the courtroom. So we can go back to the Civil War. And first, it's important to understand the Civil War was not about slavery. The Civil War was about the South seceding from the Union. The issue of slavery came up during the Civil War. And certainly one of the benefits of the Civil War was we received a document called the Emancipation Proclamation. We started off on this road towards Reconstruction. We were going to reconstruct society. But Reconstruction, although it began, it never really established itself because President Lincoln was assassinated and the person who took over, Andrew Johnson, basically handed the South back to the Confederacy. What does that mean? 850,000 acres of land that had been turned over to the Freedmen Bureau is now being returned to the people who once owned that land. The people who fought the war are now in control of making the rules for the states of the South. And they were placed in a position where they could exact revenge on African Americans. And these were individuals who used loophole. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for crimes. And so the individuals of the Confederacy enacted laws, for example, vagrancy laws and Jim Crow laws. And so if there was a minor violation, you committed a crime. And so now since you committed a crime, now you have this new type of slavery. You have prison labor that's being rented out. You have areas, for example, in Mississippi where you're forced to sign a contract with an individual who once was a slave owner. And if you don't sign that contract, then you're guilty of not being able to show that you have the ability to work. So all of this was used to oppress people. And the Jim Crow laws, the problem with the Jim Crow laws was that it changed our focus. Our focus was freedom. Our focus was the ability to participate freely in a society. And instead, what happened, Jim Crow resulted in segregation. And so the conversation became about segregation and integration. Well, the problem with integration is that you're talking about assimilating someone into an established society, the dominant society, which is the white society. Reconstruction, in reality, was about building a new society. Everyone joining together and building a new society. Had that occurred, I believe that Black lives would have had value. It did not occur. And integration, in my opinion, does not necessarily acknowledge the value of Black lives. And so then when you come into the future and you have a case like Walter Macmillan, we see how Black lives have been devalued. And it was devalued to the point where the white Southerners were willing to sacrifice him. Basically, his life had no meaning, it had no value. They had certain political objectives and they needed to protect their reputation, and they were going to do so by executing an innocent man that they knew he was innocent.
Does anyone have anything to offer to support or to refute, anything that we started talking about? Any thoughts around this idea of these institutions that have been in place historically that have really devalued Black lives, and now we're seeing Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, that's really kind of highlighting some of the issues that have always been present but not been addressed?
Hi, Erica. Thank you, Phyllis, for that awesome history and analysis. This is really, really a loaded question, Arthur, that has a lot of different components. And you could take each one of these items, these 4 primaries, and have a whole discussion behind that. But the other thing that I just wanted to add is what we're seeing today in Black Lives Matter, how it's relating to some of this is there's not a comprehensive understanding of what systemic racism is. Built in from slavery, from scratch. I mean, it's like every single institution, every single step that African Americans took during this time was what was critical, monitored, stereotyped, and we were in resistance. I mean, we were being resisted too. So those institutions that was built to keep us from upward mobility today continue to exist. And one of the problems we have is because this has not been a part of our American history that we taught our children and we continue to teach our children. We're looking at a time today where people are pushing back and says, that didn't apply to me. I never knew that existed. Why can't you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and forget about slavery? And so there's not a real understanding of the total impact of slavery as it relates to lack of generational wealth that we didn't have the ability to build and pass down to our children and our futures. Housing discrimination. Folks don't see how those laws still apply today to the institutions and the access to wealth, access to education, the equitable access to all the opportunities that white people today is privileged to. And I can certainly understand why we're getting a lot of the pushback. I know I get a lot of pushback in conversations, and it's not as much as a conversation as it is a competition. But some of that pushback is because this institutionalized racism and structural racism is just not a part of the white experience. So those are some of the things that we're addressing today in Black Lives Matter. And that's why it's almost a bad word to say, Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter is not that white lives don't matter and other lives doesn't matter. It's like Black Lives Matter also. And so we're continuously having to explain that. And in my experiences, we get that pushback to say, well, that happened 400 years ago. That happened 400 years ago. Jim Crow just happened 60 years ago. And I agree with Phyllis, you know, Reconstruction, did we really win the war when we see the monuments up today? I mean, we're idolizing traitors. Did we really, was the Civil War really actually won? And that's the question I like to put on the table.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Would anyone like to respond to that particular? I think I'm going to. Okay. So we took care of that.
Wasn't mine.
I would like to respond. I think that to a certain extent, we as African Americans have bought into these establishments that have kept us down. But through our complacencies, through, for example, in a political process, the politicians always court the African American vote, right? And to obtain that vote, they tell us what they think we want to hear, right? And then we vote accordingly, only to be disappointed in the end. And at some point, we have to understand that this power system is a power system that was built by white Americans. It's a power system where they use our vote to gain control, and then they exert their agenda. An example was Clinton's war on crime, right? Mm-hmm. So Clinton is usually referred to as our first Black president. And yet the incarceration rate under President Clinton rose the fastest than any other president, to the point where now later he comes back and say, I'm sorry. Sorry means nothing after you have traumatized millions, whether you traumatize them through incarceration, traumatize them by being stigmatized by crime, traumatize children by having the caregiver taken out of the household, traumatize households by pushing them into poverty and other households deeper into poverty. It's a system that should not be sustainable and continues to be sustainable. If we are to be, we meaning African Americans and people of color, if we are to be considered to be part of the system, we should have been allowed to build that system, and we weren't. We won a series of battles, but we did not win the war because we didn't recognize that the war was about white supremacy.
I'd like to offer a recommendation for our audience. And that is, we have a smaller group today, but no less, powerful. And I would like for you, as you're hearing these comments, bring some of your thoughts and feelings to the chat so that those of you who may not have an opportunity to speak can actually hear or read, some of the thoughts and feelings that you may have around this discussion, because we only have so much time. And last week or 2 weeks ago, we actually ran over time, which was a testimony to the importance of this discussion. So I just wanted to, encourage you that even if you don't speak verbally, that you still share your thoughts and feelings around it. I also wanted to respond to you, Ms. Williams, regarding your comment that a lot of people, usually non-Blacks, will say they didn't know. And this really speaks to some conversations we've had previously around the curriculum in our educational system and what has been omitted over the years, and just making sure that our history is accurate. And I also wanted to share my own thoughts around people who've reached out to me who have said things like, I didn't know that these were issues, and I didn't know that, people of color were really struggling, in these very specific ways. And what I have kind of said, ad nauseum is that, well, I'm not Jewish, but I certainly learned about the Holocaust, and I'm not Native American, and I certainly know about Native American genocide. And so saying that I didn't know is not really an excuse for not being aware of what's going on around our communities. And I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts around the idea that perhaps this is the time for a revamping of our educational system. And I know that we do have some educators, participating in the meeting, so I'm kind of throwing you on the spot right now.
I think you have Regina in the
There's
chat.
Moon
She
Bell.
wanted to make a comment.
Yes. Ms.
Bertha, I think you have Regina in the chat asking to make a comment. Is she still there?
Acknowledging you, Ms. Bell. You're not muted anymore. Ms. Bell? Okay, she may be experiencing some technical difficulties.
We also have two other individuals that
Okay.
indicated they would like to speak.
Absolutely.
Thomas Halen.
Mr. Halen, go ahead. You're unmuted.
Sorry, I clicked it at the same time, so I muted it.
It's okay.
No, so I followed your directions. I put my comment in the chat box, but basically, though I agree what I believe it was Phyllis Green who mentioned about, taking responsibility for the issues. I do feel that it's upon all of us to take responsibility to address the issues that are at hand, because there are systemic issues, and each one of us really need to take an active role in this. So it's not only the African American or Black population, so to speak, that needs to address it.
Thank you for that. Ms. Bell, are you available to speak now? Okay. We'll take
Hello, it's Dr. Michelle Bashirs.
Dr. Bashirs, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I want to touch on something that Mrs. Green spoke about. And, and speaking about politics, it's really hard to ignore right now that everything that's going on in our world, that politics doesn't come in to be a big play. And so I do find that that things get lost in the discussion of politics and what social media and the media. And, what you said about education and bringing it all in and getting people to calm down and listen to both sides. Because I think we're a lot closer than what we realize. But it seems as though with social media and our national media, we're hearing the extremes, and it's making it more difficult to come together. We have African Americans that are conservatives. We have whites that are liberals. And I just don't think that we need to be so far on either side of the issue. And I think that everybody just needs to calm down and listen and be open to the ideas so that we can solve a lot of these issues together, whether you're conservative or liberal or whatnot. But that's just my thought. If anybody has any thoughts on the political without getting too deep in the political.
Well, thank you for that. Ms. Bell, are you available? Okay, still having some difficulty. I'd like to respond to you, Ms. Bashirs, and maybe others can join in. When we talk about this turning into a political conversation, where do you think that comes from? Is it the media that's driving a focus on the politics of it all? Or do you think individuals who are affiliated with political parties are making this a political conversation? Because as a united nation, we all experience the same challenges. We've all been isolated or social distanced. And so we're in our homes and experiencing the same things that others are experiencing. There are people who are struggling financially because their employment, is in jeopardy. There are people who possibly might be losing their homes in the upcoming future because they may not be able to pay their mortgages or pay their rent. And so regardless of whether you're Black, white, or Hispanic, those are all very common social needs. But what we find is that people are disproportionately impacted because of the systemic inequalities and inequities throughout our nation. So how did this become a political conversation? Mr. Sanchez, you would like to comment? You are unmuted.
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So yeah, I'd like to comment about the whole argument between like the conservatives and liberals. I feel like every time when me personally, I'm a conservative, but I'm open up to ideas. So I don't really say I'm conservative or whatever, but I just feel like I lean more into it. But like every time when I talk to like liberals, I say, they get really angry if I don't agree with them without us having with us. I'm sorry, I'm a little shy right now, but
That's okay.
it's just every time we get into a conversation, they turn it into an argument instead of like both of us sharing our ideas and coming in the middle and see what we can find that both of us would like. And I feel like the media has something to do with that, because I feel like the media only really shows one side other than both sides. And I feel like that's a big problem that that we have.
Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Sanchez. Any other thoughts around that idea?
Other than that, that's really all I have.
Okay, thank you. So as we continue to explore that idea, I wanted to return to the work that you do, Ms. Morris. In the movie, there were numerous examples of improper legal representation and judicial misconduct, including destruction of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct. So how can we hold our criminal justice system accountable when people who are tasked with protecting, our communities and executing justice are abusing their power?
Okay, well, first of all, it's important to understand the players in the justice system. The district attorney is an elected official. The sheriff is an elected official. The chief probation officer is an appointed official, and the public defender is an appointed position. In terms of the elected, it's the power of the vote. In terms of the others, it's still the power of the vote, because the probation officer and the public defender, we serve at the will of the board of supervisors. So it's important for us to understand our governmental structure. Second, just like people have taken their cameras to show police brutality, you can document, not necessarily cameras, because cameras aren't allowed in the courthouse, although they are in the courthouse. You can document what goes on in the courtroom. Trials are public. You see a public documentation in the form of the Black Lives Movement protesters outside of Jackie Lacey's house. Okay, Jackie Lacey has made some controversial decisions, and there are some that agree and some that disagrees with her. But at least the protesting has brought that discussion, her decision, to a level where it can be discussed. Another way to comment on a system is to look at the laws that are imposed. The courtroom is a courtroom of social policies. And a lot of what goes on in the courtroom, even our conduct, is governed by rules and laws. as voters, we have the right to ask officials to be accountable. When you go out to these public forums, take notes of what the person is saying to you, because sometimes one politician will say A to a particular group of people and will now be saying sermon B to another group of people and sermon C to another group of people. And if you're not following that politician around from group to group to group to group, you're not going to hear these inconsistencies. And I tell you, these inconsistencies exist. Somehow we need to understand the character of an individual's heart. But what was interesting in Just Mercy, the backstory, not necessarily depicted in the movie, Sheriff Tate served 30 years as sheriff. He was reelected after the Walter McMillan case. Okay, Tommy Chapman was reelected after the Walter McMillan case. And so that gives the impression that what they did was okay, right? So if you plan to set someone up with the intent to kill because you need to solve a crime, the last time I checked the penal code, that's murder, okay? And yet we're allowing our officials to get away with what we're not allowing people of color to do. And I'm not saying that you should allow that. I'm saying understand history. In 1866, there were a series of riots where Blacks were massacred, Blacks were lynched, right? And yet, how many people were prosecuted for those outright murders? Very few, if any, if any. In the Colfax riots, there were 35 people charged, 3 convicted, and the 3 convictions were overturned on appeal. So in reality, no one was held responsible for the death of anywhere from 50 to 150 people. They have no idea how many people because bodies were dumped in the harbor. So we need to become informed. We need to ask for accountability. When we see a wrong and we see the wrong continuing over and over again, then we need to become vocal. We need to use social media. We need to use the media. For as attorneys, we have a crooked cop, we'll have like a motion to suppress day. And if that cop was involved in 5 cases that resulted in an unlawful arrest, we would put 5 cases on for that same day so that everyone can see that this cop has a pattern that needs to be addressed. And I had a judge turn around and say to an officer, I have heard a series of cases today in this courtroom, and I don't believe anything you have to say. And granted all of the motions that were in court that particular day. So we need to look and learn about the system so that we can fight back. But the power, we have the power of the vote.
So Ms. Morris, what you have just said is extremely powerful. And I'm just wondering, twofold questions. One, what reforms do we need to make within the legal system? And 2, how do we educate our citizens, particularly those who do not have access to the means of educating themselves around these processes? Even, as a well-educated professional woman, if an officer stopped me and told me I couldn't do a number of things, I would believe him because I just don't know, am I allowed to do so? And, as a Black woman, I don't want to be afraid, but I might be afraid. So I will do whatever you say so that, the situation doesn't escalate. So what can we do? And particularly speaking as an educator and as a social worker, how do we empower those individuals who are most at risk of being victims in these systems to become better informed and to be better advocates?
Okay, so you actually asked 2 questions. One, in terms of reform, and then 2, in terms of education. Okay, so an entrepreneur would say the best form of advertisement is clients going out and saying, oh, he did a good job for me, right? So the best form of advertisement is actually one-on-one conversations with each other. Another form is community forums. When I served as the public defender, we actually opened our doors. And when I used the term open our doors, we decided that it was time for us to go to the people instead of the people coming to us. So we would show up at health fairs. We would send out letters saying, if you need a speaker on a particular topic, we're willing to go in and speak. We would participate in forums. It's just word of word mouth because each jurisdiction is different. Each jurisdiction has its own set of problems and issues. We educate our clients when they come in to us. We don't just represent them on a criminal matter. There's an element of education. Community forums, I was involved in a forum where before the forum, they had me sitting next to an individual from the Rialto Police Department. So before the forum began, the individual from the Rialto Police Department moved his name tag so he wouldn't be sitting next to me. So then when the forum starts and the question was asked, well, what do I do when I'm stopped on the street? And he says, hey, if the officer is asking you questions and you have nothing to hide, then you need to answer the question. And I'm like, time out, time out. And I told him I respectfully disagree with him that you don't know why that officer stopped you. You don't know what the motive for that stop is. You don't know what that officer is trying to maybe frame you. But yes, you do have to be professional. You do have to check your mannerisms, your behavior. You have the right to ask for an attorney. If you're a juvenile, you have the right to say, I need to talk to my parent. It got heated in the exchange. And what was interesting was Representative Reyes was seated between he and I, and she looked over at him, and she's also an attorney, and she said, you know, you need to get this right. There are certain rights that people have on the streets, and we're going to outline what those rights are, contrary to what you want. There's a difference between what you want a person to do and what they have the right. They have the right to participate, and when they have the right not to participate. So in terms of education, is that one-on-one conversation, is instructors like you reaching out to an attorney saying, hey, can you come talk to my class? And encouraging people. The courthouse is a public arena, just like a park. Have free time, walk the hallways, go in, listen to a trial. Stop if you're in the afternoons. The mornings are the busy part, but in the afternoons, you can usually stop a deputy public defender and ask them questions about the legal system, and they will respond to those questions about the legal system. Reforms. California is in a season of social justice reform. In the 2 years since I have been retired, there have been quite a few reforms. I was the public defender when we implemented AB 109, which was shifting a population from the state prison into our county jails. Proposition 57, where juveniles, there's no longer direct filing in the court system. And what is direct filing is whether or not a juvenile is fit for juvenile court or adult court, which is one of the things that the book Just Mercy touches on. It's a problem in the juvenile court. Mm-hmm. One of the problems with the law is we give the district attorney a lot of discretion. Okay, we give the district attorney a lot of discretion in terms of what charges to file, in terms of what charge to plea bargain, if there's going to be a plea bargain. And they have a lot of power in terms of the arguments at sentencing. We need to be aware of this. And one of the problems with the DA's office, and maybe I shouldn't say this if it's being live streamed, but you're talking about people that are from a privileged background, okay? And you ask a question later on regarding diversity, but we see the world through our experiences. And if you don't have different people in a room, jury deliberation with different experiences, talking about a particular case, then the client can become dehumanized. And an innocent client can become unjustly convicted for a charge. So, but there's a series of criminal justice reforms. There's cash bail. California eliminated cash bail. Yet coming up in November 2020 is a referendum. If you're in favor of the law, you vote yes. If you don't like the law, you vote no. There's going to be a lot of publicity coming out by the Bail Bonds Association, and they're going to point out the most heinous of cases to get you to vote no. Each and every one of us needs to do our own research, and we aren't trained to do social policy research. But the best way to start, ballotpedia.com. Look at who's supporting which side and read the arguments for the various sides. But most importantly, read the ballot initiative. And that's a process that we need to change. Because what you find on the ballot initiative, you find A, I agree with, you find B, I agree with, and C is buried in the middle, which is something that you should be concerned about, right? There's another proposition on the ballot where buried in it, they're talking about rollbacks. So Proposition 47 was the marijuana, legalizing marijuana. Proposition 57 granted conduct credits to felons so that they would get out earlier. Well, buried in the middle of this proposition is language that defeats or dilutes the enactment of 47 and 57. It rolls it back. So we're trying to move forward, but there is a coalition of individuals who wants to move us back into the arena of mass incarceration. We need to be aware of this. We need to read and stop listening to what we hear on TV. Because what we hear on TV, they're going to tell you what they want you to hear. And they're not going to tell you everything that's buried in an initiative. And if you agree with A, B, C, and you don't agree with D, then you don't agree with the initiative, because it's the D that is going to hurt people of color. And I don't know if I answered your question. That was another loaded question. Okay, and you're muted.
Eartha, can you hear Regina?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Okay, so now I can't hear Eartha. So I'm muted from everybody now.
He can hear you.
Sorry, Eartha, you're muted, Eartha.
Regina, we can hear you.
There we go, Eartha.
Kind of going back to things that were said earlier when I wanted to chime in, but Phyllis has done such a great job of illustrating, I think, my point. And my point being that just as she has laid out the importance of us being educated, knowledgeable, and engaged and involved, that's key. It's not enough to become involved at moments when we have issues that are trendy or topical or in season. It is incumbent for all of us to not only become involved, but stay involved, right? It is also something Phyllis just gave us a beautiful example of, is to use the experts and those who are on the front line that we have access to bring this information into our communities. And whether we do that by bringing it in one-on-one or whether we do it in community forums, however we do it, we need to be about doing it, is my point. Phyllis, earlier you talked about, with Jim Crow and let's just, that particular era and things that were going on. And one of the points I wanted to make with regard to that is, this has been a game for white America in a lot of cases. And I single out white America because traditionally they are the ones who have held the elected positions, they are the ones who have made the policy, and therefore they are the ones who can change that whenever they decide it's to their benefit, right? To keep us from being effective. Let's just look at voter registration now, right? Let's just look at the opportunity to vote and what we see happening across our nation with that, right? So again, this is nothing new. This is an opportunity we now have in the face of COVID, which is this pandemic that has affected us from a world perspective, to make change, right? Now is the time. And so if we don't continue, and I want to applaud Eartha and Barstow for being able to engage us in this level of conversation and thought and discussion, because if we don't start to look at where our resources are in our communities of color and how to connect us as members of those communities to vital, valid information, right, we will find ourselves back in the same place in the circle. So my point really was earlier that it is incumbent upon us to not just have these conversations and share amongst ourselves, but now we should be charged to now going outside, sharing this information on a consistent basis, to not stop having these conversations because a policy may get passed or addressed, right? Because a county declares racism as a public health crisis. Good, great, now the work begins, right? And so that really was what I wanted to bring forth was, I guess the biggest part of my message was we need to become and stay informed and stay at the task at hand and understand that as we start to gather momentum and moving that needle, that those in power are not necessarily on our team and that they will try to change the game as they often traditionally have.
Thank you so much for saying that. Very well said. And it really kind of segues into my next question for Ms. Morris. In the book, Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson says that essentially well, let me back up. There was an article in the New York Times, and the New York Times said, the book reads like a call to action. And so Brian Stevenson says that there's a need to increase the salaries of teachers, to increase the salaries of law enforcement, to increase the salaries of social workers, those individuals who are key, I think, allies within communities of color, but there have been some abuses, within those roles in some respects. So based upon what you're saying, Ms. Bell, what do you think is one tangible step that we can all take to become more engaged in our communities and to help reform not just the justice system, but the educational system, the social welfare system, the foster care system? And many of you on the call right now are leaders, within your role. There are social workers, there are educators, there are community leaders on this call. And so I just want to ask all of you, what is one tangible action that we can take in order to not just have these conversations, but to move forward and implement some change?
Okay, again, another loaded question here. Okay, so first of all, let's look at Brian Stevenson's call to action. I believe that what Brian wants us to understand is that, hey, there has been a season of infliction of trauma upon communities of color, okay? We need a season of healing, okay? We need to start addressing the problems, the drivers, as we say in criminal law, the drivers of criminal behavior. drug addiction is not a crime. Drug addiction is a health issue, okay? Mental illness is a health issue, but we use our jails to house clients that are mentally ill. And we need to look at how we allocate our resources. And those are, again, goes back to your earlier question of reforms, what type of reforms is needed in the system. We need to invest more money in social workers and educators, because a great proportion of the incarcerated population, they're illiterate, okay? In a court system, I'll say to a client, do you understand the terms and conditions of probation? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so what are those terms? And it's a blank look, because he don't want you to know that they're illiterate, right? And I'll take the paperwork from them and I'll say, why don't I read them to you? Because I want to make sure that you understand. When you don't understand, then there's cause for a violation that can result in incarceration. And I'm going to add something to your question, which is not an answer to your question, but it just came to mind. We have mass incarceration, but there's another side of mass incarceration that I don't think people realize. There are 7 million people in the United States that are on probation or parole, some type of supervision or GPS monitoring. And the problem with supervision is that if there's a violation, that can result in incarceration. We have, 2.3 million in prison and an additional 7 million on probation or parole. In terms of a community, we need to become more forgiving, okay? A thief is not always a thief, and that's one of the themes that come across in Just Mercy. We're not defined by our error. There's a present and there is a future. And what we, in terms of our interaction with individuals, can turn around a person's future. For attorneys, and we saw this in the movie Just Mercy, your advocacy, even though you think it's just advocacy, mere words, can touch a person's life. It can motivate them. It can give them hope. It can give them the realization that there is something better out there, that I can be a better person, that yes, I can achieve. I talk to my clients about clearing their records, and I tell them, I said, look, you have to be persistent in this process, but it takes you 4 years to get a college degree. So while you're clearing your record, you can be going to college and working on that college degree. So those are little things that we can do to support individuals who find themselves trapped in this system. And a lot of times the individuals are trapped because when they get out, we, the community, we don't allow them to prove themselves the second time around. We need to become more forgiving.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. Does anyone else want to respond to that question?
Well, I was giving everybody an opportunity, but I would like to respond to the piece that you asked the question regarding education. What can we do? Should we revamp education? Yes. The answer to that question, we should dismantle it and revamp it. Our educational institutions, especially K through 12, has omitted or eliminated or has been exclusive of other races. Therefore, growing up in America under the structures of racism and barriers, our children are required to learn everything that there is to know about American history, European history, how other people live and cultures. But when it comes to our history is eliminated. Our students, they don't understand their history in terms of their greatness, their inventions. They don't understand it in terms of slavery and all the trauma and the structural and DNA trauma that has followed, generational trauma that's associated with that. As a result of that, Eartha, Black people and white people live in two different Americas. And those different Americas are based on our experiences. My experience today is every single time my son walks out the door or my daughter walks out the door, I'm afraid until they come home. That's trauma. That's generational trauma. And I don't know I don't know what it feels like to be privileged enough to not have experienced that. My mother doesn't know what it feels like to not have experienced that. I have never, through K through 12, nor has my children, have been indoctrinated with African American, Native American, Latino history, or Chinese American, Jewish American history as a whole, as an inclusive. I remember when I went to college, African American history they were electives. I fought to have those elective classes in African American history, psychology of the Black experience, and various African American history class incorporated into my regular curriculum. Why? Why should I have had to do that? There's a privileged class that have no idea what these experiences are because they have never walked in the shoes of those experiences. They may have never walked in the shoes of going to purchase a house. When I first purchased my house here in Apple Valley, there was a clause in the deeds that they didn't sell houses here in Apple Valley to Black people. I don't have the privilege of not knowing what that feels like. So when I say we live in two different Americas, when I talk about systemic and structural racism, I'm not calling an individual a racist. I'm saying every system that I have to walk through, that I have to make gains through, there are barriers and structures that privileged people do not have to go through. It's almost like Michelle Harris Perry talks about the crooked room. And the crooked room where Black folks are in a room and the room is always crooked. So we've got to figure out what's right side up. And that represents the underrepresented, which is what we're called, which we're not, but that represents minorities, where the room is upright and white people have a straight shot up to the top. And in that crooked room, while we're trying to figure out how to assimilate in education, you talked about segregation. You talked about integration of schools. I came from a segregated environment where schools were richer. So when they asked the question is, was segregation or integration into schools, was integration a great thing for African Americans? What are the outcomes of that? Well, in my experience and my children's experience, we weren't really integrated. We were just taught what they wanted us to learn. And I remember my mother saying to me as a young girl, she said something to the effect, well, why would the white slave masters teach our children what they need to know to be successful in this system of America? Because for many years, we weren't even allowed to learn how to read. So education, yeah, it should be inclusive. 2020, all groups, Americans, should be included in our educational studies, and our children should have that exposure.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. We have 2 more minutes remaining. It always seems as the time goes by so quickly when we're involved in such important conversations. Is there anyone who would like to make the last comment before we wrap up? And it looked like a couple of you were interested in speaking. Dr. Bagg? There you go.
Bertha, I appreciate that. I was going to type it in, but no, I just, no, this is so powerful. I'm processing everything that I'm hearing, and I feel a great responsibility in my role at Barstow Community College as president. And it strikes me that many of us have Blacks and whites, we have been looking at, strategically, equity is such an important issue. And I think, as a white person in this role, I realize that despite a lot of systemic efforts from the level of our chancellor, right, the state that oversees all 115 colleges, there's lots of changes that are happening. But I feel in my role, what I'm discovering is that, I have to listen to see what's the actual impact of any of the policies and procedures that we're putting into practice. And I have to say, Eartha, you helped me just with one program with regard to one student group designed for African Americans that, we can check it off to say we have one of those on campus, but we have to listen to the voices of those individuals for whom it's designed to make people feel included and part of the system and not overlooked and fully supported. And you helped me to understand that those individuals do not feel that way. So I think that the burden is on those of us who, are from a privileged group to take the effort to listen and to ask questions and to provide the conditions that people feel safe in reporting that, yeah, you have that thing happening, but it's not working. So that's all, there's so much more to learn and work to be done. And I just want to thank all of the participants today. Ms. Green, thank you for the education you've brought to us and the suggestions. And I don't want to take any more airspace, but thanks for the opportunity to let me speak.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bagg. This really concludes our conversation for today. And before we go, I just want to remind everyone that as difficult as the conversations are, and as difficult as the images have been in our media, as difficult as the content from some of these movies have been, I walked away from Just Mercy seeing the message of hope that Brian Stevenson was really trying to share, a message of redemption. And so I am hopeful that through our conversations that we will continue to the next step to identify what are the outcomes from these conversations, what are the things that we can do within our roles. And a lot of what I've heard is really about educational reform, about personal responsibility to understand our rights and roles within the legal system. And I would dare say the idea that all of us are responsible for one another, responsible for understanding the experiences that we have had. Ms. Williams talked about understanding our history. And I would say that our history didn't begin, if we're talking about Black, people in America, it's a varied history. I'm Caribbean, so my history harkens, further back than just America. And African-American history harkens back to their days as rulers in an African continent and leaders, of so many things. So I think it is, incumbent upon us as educators to ensure that all students feel as though they're affirmed, they understand where they came from, that they're hopeful that even though circumstances have contrived to deprive them, of reaching their full potential, that because of conversations like these, and my hope is future conversations, that we can develop very focused and targeted practices that will change what has been done, and that will bring to the forefront the issues. And that really requires honest conversation, a willingness to say, I didn't know, a willingness to say, I don't know, I don't have all the answers. And that's what I heard from this conversation today. I heard a lot of just passionate conversation around the need for us to change what's happening within our communities. And although Barstow is sometimes seen as distant from Victorville and Hesperia, I think COVID has really brought everyone together, and through this virtual world, we are now more connected than we ever have been before. So I want to thank all of you for being a part of this conversation. truly. And I'm hoping that you will join us next Friday as we really talk about activism. We will look at Selma and really kind of the spark, that has created what we see now, people really standing up to say, this isn't right. We're not going to take it anymore. And so I hope you will join us next week. If you would like to share some of the resources, Ms. Williams, you mentioned a couple of books today. And I know in the last conversation that we were a part of, you had shared some. So I would ask you to email me some of those, because I am trying to put together a book list. And I'm also trying to develop a social justice book club. And so this would be something that we would encourage not only our college faculty and staff and students, but community members to also participate in. And so even though I may not be as technologically savvy with Zoom, I think the Zoom thing, is a winner. It's bringing people together. So I just want to say thank you all for participating. And I look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you.